Hello and welcome to the Understory Podcast. This is Lord Sycamore. I've got a very special guest interviewer today, my wife Kate. Hi,
Hello. Nice to be here. Thanks. So today we wanted to talk about the song Lilac Orchestra, which in a lot of ways is both a mixed experience for me. I love the instrumentation. I love lilacs. And I think the chorus is very beautiful. And I love the story that it tells, but some of the details are really difficult for me, both the way that they line up with our own story and some of them that I just like, I don't relate to that. That doesn't line up at all. Why don't you tell a little bit about where this story came from and some of the ways that it does line up with our story?
Sure. It is not entirely an autobiographical story. There's very much a way this was created for the album to fit a specific place in the story. That being said, it was inspired by this experience that we had before we were engaged, when we were at my parents' house and just had to have a hard conversation where I was telling you things from my past that were very hard to hear, that I actually had to just ask forgiveness for. And you did forgive me, and you did commit to get married to me. We got engaged, and we got married, and we were back at my parents' house, maybe within that first year of marriage, just pretty much in the same spot. And it came back to me as we were there, just how far we'd come from that place of fear and recognizing like the damage that had been done by choices that I'd made, to a place of trust and intimacy and just knowing that we were for each other and united. And you were telling me about your favorite flowers, lilacs, and how you had this vision of them filling up your front yard with beauty and fragrance, and just 100 lilacs, 1,000 lilacs. And that was pretty inspiring to me, because you were looking at me in a way that was saying, this isn't actually about the lilacs, this is about you. I want to do this with you. And just to come from that place of not knowing if I was going to be rejected, if I confessed the ways that I'd failed or been unfaithful, even before we got married, to coming to this place of recognizing I'm with someone who's going to be faithful to me and who I'm going to be faithful to. That was just beautiful, and it touched me really deeply. And so I sat down and I wrote what became like the first line of the chorus. I want to help you plant 100 lilacs in our front yard. That part. And that's basically where the song came from. There was another part that came in later. Another difficult conversation was just talking about pornography and how that had been a part of my past, and the ways that I tried to find intimacy apart from God and apart from you. And I was in this songwriting group with my friend Davis, and the prompt was this line, scrape your knee, it is only skin, hear the sound of violins, or something like that. And for me, that sort of stirred up this place I'd been in my life where I'd been listening to violin music while looking at pornography. And the thing that changed it for me, and this became the bridge of both this song I wrote for Davis's group and Lilac Orchestra eventually, was recognizing that Jesus's voice to me is full of forgiveness, and he tells me what's right, but he restores me to that rightness by his power, not mine. And the beauty that he has is so much more powerful and compelling than any artificial beauty that I could find in pornography or in a relationship that's not within the confines of what he wants for me. And that bridge, the King of Glory, he died for my shame, and the oh, for the music I hear in his voice, a million orchestras playing in tune. That became the bridge of Lilac Orchestra after I discarded the old song, because that's where the character in the song ends up, basically.
Yeah,
He's recognizing that Jesus is beautiful and compelling and worth leaving a life of sin behind for.
I think as I'm sitting here listening to you share this stuff, there's part of me that's like, oh man, Nate, do you really want to put this out there for everyone? And the other part of me, as we've had this conversation before all through when you're writing the song, is yes, this needs to be said. We can't hide, and I would just like to extend an invitation if this is something you've struggled with, or you know someone who's struggling with, or you're struggling with the aftermath of someone else's sin, or anything like that. There needs to be vulnerability about this issue, especially within the church, and this is my invitation. I'm sure Nate would also extend this to you, to reach out and find help and find someone you can talk to about whatever you're struggling with. But just hiding whatever you're going through is not an option. And I think, as Nate expresses in just now, but also in this song, it's actually a bridge to greater intimacy than hiding. And if you're afraid of confessing because it will ruin a relationship, we've found that actually that coming clean has taken away any kind of secrecy and allowed for a much deeper and richer life together. So I just want to extend my invitation and call to those who are listening: find help. Don't let these things hide. It's really important.
I agree. And while you're saying that, Kate, I'm thinking about the song on the album, My Hiding Place, which is the words of Psalm 32. Words from the Bible that I had to keep going back to as I worked through these things were words like in Psalm 32, where it says that I confessed my transgressions to Yahweh. I talked to you, God, I told you what I'd done. And then the very next line is, and you forgave the guilt of my iniquity. So there's no place on earth where you're promised that if you confess your sin, you're going to be forgiven. But there is a Father in heaven who through the offer of his Son does give us that hiding place. So for me, the only way to move from hiding my sexual sins to confessing them to my wife was first to confess them to God and to receive forgiveness and even the strength to do that thing. I also needed friends and brothers in Christ to give me accountability and to talk with me and to talk to. So it was a very complex and painful process, but being on the other side of that, I would say, yeah, it's worth it. Lots of joy.
Yeah, Psalm 32, thanks for bringing that up. Psalm 32 for me is really important. I remember, I'm sure I had read it before, but one of the times that sticks out to me of reading it was when you and I were in Oxford and studying with Kevin Bywater, and he was talking about Psalm 32 as a pattern for repentance, and that's not just a one-time deal of like, oh, I repented from my sins and then I was, good to go, and then I went about my way and I lived my life. It's like, no, this is something you do every day, maybe multiple times a day. And just, I think that's also important, of that confession and receiving God's forgiveness is so important to keep in the forefront of our minds and our lives, because it doesn't, when you're doing that, you don't have room for these huge sins to grow. If you're always coming back and asking God for forgiveness for the things that you've done wrong, or the things that you've left undone that you ought to have done. And if that's just a pattern of your life, there's no room for it's like weeding every day. There's no room for the big weeds to grow if you're out there every day getting them when they're small. And I think, so that's what Psalm 32 means for me. And I think that's very relevant to this discussion about particularly sexual sin, but any kind of sin. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me, Nate, a little bit how the song grew?
Yeah, after I had these two seeds of the Lilac Orchestra, of the end of the beginning of the chorus and the bridge, I just sat with them for a while. I didn't really have any particular plans to make a song out of it. But around summer 2019, when we were going off to Maine with your family.
So that would have been almost 4 years after we were married.
Yeah, so like I said, they sat for a while. We had the seeds, we put them in the bag, and put them off to the side. I'd been having this story of Child Coming Home sort of brewing in my head, and I'd had actually most of the songs together at that point. I thought at that point that the album was going to end with New Father. I hadn't yet realized that Aching to Be Had and Passing Through were going to be in the picture. But I recognized, just from a logistical standpoint, at the end of Wanderlost, the man has been on this journey, and then suddenly a new father, he's married and he has a kid. And I was looking at that gap and recognizing there's something that needs to go there.
Yeah, something major.
Something major.
Which is kind of what Lilac Orchestra is. It's a whopping 7-8 minutes long.
6.5, 7, something like
okay.
that. Yeah. So at the... I first went back to where I started with the story, which was New Father, and I dug down and tried to figure out what is it that this guy wants, what's been driving him on this journey, and recognized that he's been wanting to be in a relationship, and then underneath that, he realizes by the time he's lost his relationship and new apartment that he wants to have a home and he wants to have a family. He goes on this spiritual journey where he realizes those things are sort of pointing to the reality that a relationship with God gives him those things most ultimately. But by the time he gets to Wanderlost, he's still looking to have a family and a home and a wife, and then suddenly a new apartment, he's got them. So
not a new apartment. Suddenly a new father.
He's
got them.
He's got them.
How did he get there? Right.
So I set out writing Lilac Orchestra to answer the question of how he got married and how he had a kid. And so as I was casting about for things I'd written on the topic before, I found this first seed of I want to help you plant 100 lilacs in our front yard, which when I first wrote it maybe had some other lyrics about going on a date to a botanical garden or something.
Well, that was actually why I'm sure I was telling you about one of my favorite times in Brooklyn, when I'd gone to the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and it was in probably about now when the lilacs are blooming, so it's May. And lilacs are just so beautiful, and they had all different kinds of both the English and the French, and then all sorts of varieties that were striped or streaked, or different big flowers, small flowers, sweeter smelling or less. And the variety was just so amazing, and it was very calm underneath them because they had trimmed them to be more tree-like and less short trees, but less bushy outwards, and so there was space underneath them, and you could go underneath and just kind of lay down and look up at the purple and green and be surrounded by this sweet-smelling place. And so I'm sure I had related that to you. So if there were other lyrics, they were probably about that. But anyway, carry on.
They were about the things you described about the lilacs, which beautiful. And the feeling of being in love and wanting to have something more come of your love was really what I was trying to get at when I started writing the song. And I got decently far taking that approach. I think I maybe made a couple different versions of the chorus, but none of them really held together. And I couldn't figure out why. And I think it was that summer I went to the wedding of one of my friends. And normally we would go to these things together, but for whatever reason...
I was helping with another wedding that was on the same day.
Yeah. So I was going off to a college friend's wedding, by myself, and it was a very long car drive. I'm also very bad with directions, so I think I got lost and made it longer. But as I'm driving, I'm recognizing, I'm talking to God about basically what I'm trying to figure out for this song. And at a certain point in the car ride, I got convicted that I was trying to tell this really great story about how this guy's gone on this spiritual journey, and he's like come home and he's learned so many things, but that in some ways I wasn't being honest about how my own story has influenced this, and really giving those experiences, because they were negative, a chance to speak into the story. So that was when I started writing. The first verse was on the car ride, and I remember I was just like weeping in the car as I was driving to the wedding, and just working through how painful it was, now that I had the spiritual awareness of being united to Christ and being united to you, of how the choices I'd made earlier in my life, like what they really meant, and more than that, what they signified, that they were just coming from a heart that was dead and that only lived for itself and not for God or not towards anybody else. And so the first verse about all those very stark images, ice and like sewing
Wastes.
to an iron grave and waste. It's pretty depressing, but I also just had to be honest about what Scripture says, like in Ephesians 2, that we're dead in our trespasses and sins before Christ makes us alive. It was with that passage in mind that I started working on the second verse too. The deadness, the spiritual deadness that it talks about in verse 1 gives way to spiritual life that it talks about in verse 2 through Christ's death and resurrection. Because the Son arose, we also can rise spiritually. We can have new life. We can be born again. And that's what I was trying to get at in the second verse. When I actually got to my college friend's wedding, I was all by myself, and yet it was really beautiful to just be able to sit sort of in the quietness of being by myself. As a family, you don't often
Not very quiet.
not a lot of time for reflection. But I was able to see what was happening in the wedding of these two people giving themselves to each other with a very explicit awareness. These two, husband and wife, of how they were being a picture of Christ and his church, and it was often talked about. And some of these different threads of the song started to come together. I guess they're at the wedding. I think I'm just realizing that now and telling you that seeing the marriage get started and seeing how explicitly it was happening with family and with community surrounding them, supporting them, holding them accountable to this high calling of being married. It made me realize that what Christ saves us from, what the singer recognizes he's been saved from, is important, but he also saves us to something, and that's fruitfulness. And that's where I think the idea of the flowers, the lilacs, started to come back in really powerfully for me, because I recognized the marriage is for a couple things. One, it's to be a picture of this very trusting and intimate relationship where these two different individuals are working together, completely unified. But also, like in a physical sense, it's you have children, and that goes all the way back to in Genesis 1 of being created in the image of God. You be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. There's this ruling and this also multiplying or expanding. That's part of our vocation for being human. At least it was originally. And Adam and Eve, they botch it, and they go off the rails, and they turn the whole project inward and toward themselves. And yet God doesn't abandon them, and he doesn't say your vocation doesn't matter. He says you're going to be saved someone from your line is going to come. So keep doing the thing that I told you to do in the meantime while you trust me in the broken world. And that goes all the way, that line of the person who comes, and it's Jesus. And when he comes and he says he's the true vine and that we're the branches, and he says that John the Baptist says about him, he's the bridegroom. Like all of these images that have been filled up in scripture sort of come rushing together, that he's the one that we've been waiting for us to be joined to, like a wife is joined to a husband, for us to be connected to, like a branch is connected to a vine, and for us to find our way home through, he says, I'm the way. And the beautiful thing about realizing that was that then the rest of the song sort of fell into place from there, because Jesus himself picks up that old vocation that Adam and Eve had of what it means to be human, and he sort of makes it spiritual and eternal in the sense that he gives his disciples the Great Commission and says, go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and I'll be with you always, even to the end of the age. And when he's saying that, he's saying, you're the new humanity, you're the new family of God. This is the new thing that God's doing, and I'm your husband. Like, the church is my bride, and I'm going away. He ascends, but he's also going to come back, and in the meantime, like, his church is waiting for him, and through his Spirit, like, doing that multiplying thing. So I guess to then bring in that second seed of the bridge that came out of my wrestling with pornography, the bridge of the song became this space where I, and I guess the singer, have a glimpse at what it means for the people of God to be God's bride, and just the glory of being loved by someone who's so pure and powerful and magnificent, even in our weakness and our humility, to the point that in our shame he would come and die for us, and he would take that and he would cover our shame, even though he's glorious and has no shame about him. And then just the fact that he then calls us to be fully human and to be multiplying complete humans, and he wants God's family, God's sons and daughters, to be even more full and complete. All of those images sort of came rushing together for me in the bridge.
Can you say the words of the bridge, just to tie all that back to the song?
The King of Glory, he died for my shame. He hung there naked and mocked on the cross. He told me, child, if you trust in my name, my love will welcome you home from your loss. Oh, for the music I hear in his voice, a million orchestras playing in tune. Today I'll put to death any sin that he died to save me from, so I'll be ready when he returns soon.
Okay.
Yeah, and the million orchestras, it's just, when you've got an orchestra playing, you have all of these different instruments working together to play the same music, and the more members you have as part of that community of expressing something important, the more amazing it is, the more awe-inspiring. And Jesus says that the church is going to be made up of people from every tongue, tribe, and nation. It's like the orchestras can't even point a shaky finger at that reality. So I'd say it's, in that sense, it's the most transcendent moment of the album, because he's able to glimpse something of like the side of heaven that we experience in like worshiping God as a body of believers.
Did you have anything else you wanted to say about how the song grew?
When we were in Maine and I recognized fully how the song was going to fit into the story, I snuck away from everybody with a guitar, and I worked out how the whole thing was going to go. So I got the entire structure. But I had in the back of my mind that this is a song called Lilac Orchestra, and the arrangement should have strings. And this weird opportunity came up that the people we were renting from came to your dad and said, you know, there's a place that plays classical music right down the road, and there's going to be like a string quartet putting on a concert. Would you like to come? Oh, yes, he said, I would like to come. I said, I would like to come. I think I stayed up all night finishing the arrangement for Come to Me so that I could workshop it with you and your siblings.
Yeah.
And then
First thing in the morning, you went to the orchestra because it was like a sit in the rehearsal kind of performance. It wasn't the evening performance. It was in the morning.
Reduced ticket price for it being a rehearsal. It was no less good for it being a rehearsal, and it got the beauty of those different stringed instruments working together in my head, and in my heart, and sort of running around in there. So that when it came later that summer to arranging the piece, I could bring some of that back in to overlay and play with the piano part throughout.
So can you really quickly remind us where this song fits into the larger story of the album?
Yeah, the man has not been married yet, and he doesn't have a child yet, and he can't get a child without a mother and hopefully a wife. And he has gone on this long journey. So in Lilac Orchestra, I picture that he's gotten a home, and he's gotten married, and he's in a garden, and he's leaning on a rake, and he sort of looks back over everywhere he's been, and he makes this poem called Lilac Orchestra, and he sings it to Jesus, and it's very retrospective. So he looks back with new spiritual understanding through his time being shaped in a Jesus community, the church, and he says, I was spiritually dead. God made me spiritually alive. And then, after he worships in the bridge, in verse 3, that's where he reflects on how he met his wife and what a gift that was, and how beautiful she is, and not only beautiful, her face and body, of course, but her spirit, and how she's been raised to love the things of God and to know what's right and to care about those things deeply. And he has this assurance going into this marriage that her upbringing will help him and his children to stay grounded in the deep truths of the faith. And so he sort of wrestles through again, though, because I don't know if this was as much the case for you, but when I thought about having kids, one of the things I thought was, I'm really going to mess them up. And I have all of these patterns of sin that are still in my life, ones I can't even see sometimes, and I'm going to be passing those down. And what hope do I have that this project of making children is going to be successful? Not in terms of whether we can have kids, but in terms of how they're going to turn out and how I'm going to influence them. So the part in verse 3 about shadow of doubt falling over the garden bed is this question of like, is this ever going to work if I was so sinful to have children? Like, what is that? What's going to happen there?
I think actually you saying that kind of makes that verse make more sense to me, because I've always been like, I don't relate to that part of the song. Like, what are you talking about? Like, we have a great marriage. So that's helpful, because yes, I absolutely have those feelings of, as a parent, oh my goodness, like, I'm going to mess them up. And I think like, I think the answer that we keep coming back to, and that hope that we have is God's grace that's covering us, and so now that makes a lot more sense, like what you're talking about in that verse.
Sure.
Not as like a relational like problem that we're having in marriage, but rather this sense of, wow, we are fallen creatures, we're sinful, and now we're having more sinful creatures.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
not only are they sinful, but we're passing our sin, like the ways that we respond to their sin is going to be sinful. And and it can get depressing, and so yes, I struggle with that often every day. And so the answer is Jesus Christ, grace that covers all, and that love covers a multitude of sins.
I should mention that many of the phrases in the song, like seed and garden bed, are not literal phrases. It's purely symbolic. The phrase garden bed is talking about the space where you have little things growing. So that's more of a reference to home than anything marital, so to speak. So the shadow of doubt that fell over the garden bed is the next line is, will it ever, we were rebel dirt, will it ever work to make more of us? And like you were saying, the next line, yes, because it is his seed in us that made us alive. God's divine spiritual intervention in our own hearts is what's made the difference. It's not something we did or mustered up.
Yeah, I think that's encouraging. And now it takes care of that one part of the song that I'm like, I don't know about that. What is that talking about? Is there anything else you wanted to close with before we wrap up for today?
I wanted to thank you for being my wife and for being my interviewer. Your support, your forgiveness, your help, even when you didn't quite understand what was going on with this song. And ultimately your trust in God, that he's the one who's got his hand on my life and my heart, has been so encouraging and has really been, I'd say, the main thing that's given me the confidence to do any of this that I'm doing. So thank you. I love you.
You're welcome. It's been a privilege to be part of the process, both musically, but also the real life stuff. I love you too.
I guess I don't have to say goodbye because we live in the same house.
I guess not. You can just grin really big at each other.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please consider purchasing my music or donating to this work through my Patreon. Either way, I hope this was a gift to you and that you were encouraged by it. Have a good day, and God bless.